Well, as we begin our second lesson in our course on prophetic genre, we're going to look at narrative and poetical analysis. Narrative and poetical analysis. So what is this? This should be familiar to you because we're building off of what you've learned from our narrative genre course and the poetical genre course. And now we're combining both of them together. And that's why we've taught the courses in the order in which we have, because you need to have already been exposed to narrative genre and poetical genre and all the details surrounding those two genres, especially in terms of exegesis, if you're going to understand how that would apply when you're looking at prophetic texts. So since the prophetic genre is written in the style that incorporates either narrative or poetic, and sometimes you'll find both together, it's important for you, the exegete, you, the pastor, the student of Scripture, to examine the text from either of these perspectives or both of them, both perspectives, when they're both combined into one passage. So when you think of prophetic genre, there's not a different style of writing in terms of, well, there's a different style of writing, but it's not in the terms of how it looks on the printed page. When you're reading prophetic genre, you're reading either a narrative format or you're reading poetical format, and sometimes you may have something that kind of can look like an epistle, but we'll talk about that in a future lesson. It's called sermon analysis, and we'll look at that in one of the future lessons. But in terms of how it looks, it's basically narrative or poetic, and sometimes you'll have a prophetic passage that combines both into one. So this is one of the reasons why the previous courses, like I said, were taught to you, and why we could not really teach you prophetic genre until now. So you want to be aware of that. We focused on narrative genre, we focused on poetical genre to prepare you for what's coming. And so you want to be aware of this. As you read the prophetic passages, as you read passages that are from the prophetic genre, you want to be aware of that. And in our class time, in our previous class, I wanted to give you some exposure to that, show you what it looks like, get you acquainted with how it looks on the printed page. And so you can be ready for the exegetical examination that will come about in these lessons that we're beginning to embark upon. So just know that what we're doing now is taking a step back here to look at the passage in the way it looks, and we're going to focus on the narrative aspects, and we're going to focus on the poetical aspects. So what would be the procedure? How would you go about working through a prophetic passage in terms of the narrative and poetical aspects of it? Well, that's an interesting question, and we need to answer that. The specific procedure to follow when you're examining the narrative and poetical genres is you don't change from what you've already learned. Isn't that great? You're doing the same thing. Now, it's kind of at maybe a smaller scale, especially when there's both together. But you don't really add anything new to the equation at this point. What we taught you in the previous courses in terms of narrative and poetic, you'll follow those same procedures. There may be a little bit uniqueness as we go forward. There are some new aspects that you need to look for, and we're going to talk about that in future lessons. But in terms of the narrative and the poetical parts, you just start with the passage and you approach it the way you've already been taught. So that's the beauty of all this. Now, when you're looking at the narrative and the poetical aspects, you don't want to forget about like historical situation, the historical background. You don't want to forget about making textual observations. You don't want to forget about doing significant word analysis. You did those already in narrative and poetical texts. That comes over as well. I don't want to belabor the point and talk about historical background and prophetic passages and textual observations in prophetical passages and have a separate lesson on that. There's no need to do that anymore. My assumption is you already know that this is a part of the process. So if you take the narrative analysis aspect of the exegetical process and the poetical aspect, just follow those procedures that we described to you, that were taught to you in those 2 previous courses, you will automatically look at the historical background, the historical situation. You're going to look at the line relationships and the stanza analysis. You're going to do it all. It's going to be there. And I want you to be aware of that. So think of it this way. When you're looking at a prophetical passage, and your passage that's been assigned to you may be entirely in poetical format. Yours may be entirely in a narrative format. Or it could be a mixture of both. So what I want to do is give you the full procedure, just kind of give you a good overview of this, help you to see this, and talk about narrative, talk about the poetical parts of it, and then we will talk about what is it like if they're combined. So to begin with narrative genre. When you're looking at your prophetical passage, and if there's narrative portions there, and you can easily tell that if it's not in poetical form, okay? Then what do? Well, you complete a character analysis of it. You complete a setting analysis, a scene analysis, and a plot analysis. Those are the steps, right? Now, if you remember, within setting analysis, you did textual observations, historical background. Those things were included in the process. You're also going to want to make sure that you don't forget about significant words, even though in the exegetical assignments in the class, significant words comes later in the course. But you want to go back and remind yourself of these things, because you're going to have to do the same thing. Like if you're looking at the book of Jonah, for example, it's technically classified in the prophetic genre. But when you look at that, it's really a narrative, isn't it? It's a historical narrative book in terms of its format. You want to be aware of that. Now you say, well, why is it not included in the historical books previous in the Old Testament? It's because there are a little bit of prophetical aspects to it that you would want to be aware of moving forward. Things that we're going to talk about in future lessons. But in terms of its format, it's a historical narrative. And when you look at the book of Isaiah, most of Isaiah, a good portion of that, is in poetical format. Like if you're going to study Isaiah 53, the suffering servant passage, you're going to realize that that's all in poetry, mainly poetical format. But then when you look at a book like Daniel, you're going to find here's a chapter that's a narrative chapter. Here's another one that's a narrative. And then here's a chapter that has narrative, but then there's all this poetry as well. And then you're going to find chapters where it's all in poetry, or the majority of it is in poetry. So that book has a combination of both. And you need to be aware of that. So when you're looking at the narrative genre portions, you want to complete a character analysis, setting analysis, scene analysis, plot analysis. And then when you get to passages that are poetical in nature, in terms of the form of it, then you would need to do a line relationship. You need to look at figurative language. You know, when we talk about prophetic genre, most of the times when prophetic genre is discussed, there's always discussion about symbolism, figurative language. I don't need to rehash that or go back through that again with you. You're going to be aware of that already, because the figurative language is inherent within poetical language primarily. You may even see figurative language within narrative. But again, I don't have to go through that and give you a separate lesson on that, because you should be aware of that. So you'll do line relationship, you'll complete a figurative language analysis, a historical occasion analysis, classification analysis, stanza analysis, and you may have a poetical passage that's not even broken up into stanzas. It may just be one major stanza. But again, you've been exposed to all this already in the previous courses. So when you think about studying a prophetic passage, you start there. You start with the narrative and the poetical format and just go with what you've already learned. That's how this works. You start where you're at with what you've already learned, and then you move forward. So you go back through these procedures that we've discussed before. That's why we have these videos, because I know you may have forgotten some things from narrative by this point, or things that were taught in the poetical course, and you want a refresher. And now you can go back to previous videos that we've made and remind yourself of these things. So that's where we start, with looking at the narrative and the poetical portions and just following the same procedure. And that will include textual observations. That will include the historical background. That will include all of those aspects that we've covered in the past. Now, I want to give some special considerations that you need to be aware of in terms of the narrative and the poetical formats. I want you to be aware of a few things in terms of your exegetical analysis. And the special consideration is focused primarily on the amount of exegetical data that you're going to observe. The amount of exegetical data that you will collect, if you want to call it that. If your passage that you're studying contains only narrative genre, it's just a narrative genre, there's no poetry involved, then what you need to realize is that the amount of exegetical data that you're going to collect, that you're going to gather when you study the character analysis, setting analysis, scene analysis, plot analysis, you do your textual observations, your historical background, and do all that we've discussed in that. It's going to be very similar to the amount that you collected when you did the exegesis for narrative passages, for the historical books, like passages from 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, Gospel of Matthew, Acts, and so on. And I just want you to be aware of that. You're going to have to collect a certain amount of data. You're going to make a certain amount of observations. Since the entire passage is narrative, in one sense, you're going to think that you're just studying a historical narrative passage. But you've got to go a little deeper than that, as we will tell you in future lessons. In regards to sermon analysis, foretelling, those are new aspects that you're not aware of yet. But in terms of the narrative exegetical study that you accomplish on this passage, just that the amount collected will be the same. You're going to need to really dig deep here and find out who the characters are. Look at the setting. Look at the scene. The one thing is that when you look at prophetical passages in terms of them being in narrative format, you really won't find parables there. Maybe you're saying, praise the Lord. No parables. But you won't find it as much. Especially the parables that are in like the gospel accounts in that kind of way. But just be aware of that. You got to think about that. In addition, however, other aspects of the exegetical process will emerge, since the passage does appear in the prophetical genre. As I've mentioned, we're going to look at sermon analysis in a future lesson. We're going to look at foretelling. That's going to be in a future lesson. And these are aspects that you need to be aware of, because that's what's unique about prophetic genre. And you need to be able to understand those and analyze those, because it's a part of what you're going to need, the exegetical data you're going to need to be able to get to the point of the what, why, and how. So that's going to increase the amount of exegetical data that you will need to obtain and observe. So good passages of these are like Daniel 3, Jonah 1. They're all in narrative format. But as you go through those chapters, and it doesn't mean that you can only preach Daniel 3 as a whole, or Jonah 1, you could break it down into a couple of sermons, but it's really a context. If in terms of studying the passage, it's a full unit. And as you examine that, you're going to need to do the the full narrative analysis process, the character setting scene and plot, and bring it all together. But that you don't stop there. When you do that, you're still not ready to preach your sermon or even try to begin working on a sermon content document. You still got to look at sermon analysis and foretelling. That's very important. You got to be aware of that. So think about that when you're looking at prophetic genre, but it's in the format of narrative in terms of the amount of exegetical data. It will be to the same level plus more because of what comes next. Now, what about if it's poetical genre? Same thing applies. If your passage is entirely in poetical genre, you're going to have the equivalent of the same amount of information because you're studying a passage that's in poetry. Now, your passage could be smaller than what a psalm would have been, shorter amount of verses, and that would be, that would change the amount, if you want to call it that. But in terms of the equivalence, if you were looking at 5 verses in the prophetic genre passage and 5 verses in a psalm, you're going to have to put in the same amount of study time. That's my point. You're going to have to collect data in regards to exegetical data, in regards to line relationships, figurative language, historical occasion, the classification aspect of this, stanza analysis, especially if there's multiple stanzas involved. You're going to accomplish, and through your exegetical study, you're going to arrive at the same amount of data. So you're going to ask yourself, what's brand new? Well, there are some brand new aspects, and that goes back to that sermon analysis and foretelling analysis. So if you think about looking at passages from Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, when it was primarily all poetic in nature, you're going to be doing something very similar. And what I'm going to emphasize more in this course is how do you synthesize it all together? And I'll talk more about that in just a little bit. But in terms of the exegetical amount of data, it's going to be about the equivalent. Except, in addition, like I said, for narrative, you're going to have more. Other aspects will emerge in the exegetical process because of sermon analysis, foretelling analysis. And it could be more prolonged, thereby increasing the amount of exegetical data to obtain and observe. Good passages here is if you look in Nahum, it's like chapters 1 to 3. It's a full one passage. You're like, wow. Yeah. So a lot of these poetical passages, when it's all poetical, can be lengthy. And we'll talk more about that in sermon analysis. But you'll find poetical passages that are real lengthy. I haven't assigned any of those in class for our course. You shouldn't have to worry about that for your course, for the passage I've assigned you. But just be aware that exists. And again, that comes up more in sermon analysis, but you'll see that. We'll talk about that. Jonah 2. Jonah 1 is narrative, but Jonah 2 is basically poetry. The entire chapter is poetry. Poetical format. May have been mistaken to tell you that all Jonah was narrative, but it's chapters 1, 3, and 4 is narrative. Chapter 2 is really poetry. So you just want to be aware of that. If your passage is just one or the other, then even though you say, well, I'm only doing half the work, not really. You still got to study the full passage. You just got to realize that the amount of exegetical material, data that you're going to collect and observe will be similar to what you learned from a narrative passage in narrative analysis and poetical passage in poetical analysis. Now, what if you have a passage where there is a combination of the two? Where narrative and poetry exist in the same preaching passage? Then the amount of exegetical data is going to be a combination of the both, but it's still going to be the equivalent. Because your poetry section is smaller, your narrative section is smaller, and you're going to have to find out how they relate with each other. It actually makes it a little bit more challenging. Besides the sermonic elements and the foretelling elements that could exist in the passage, they may exist, they may not. But you definitely have narrative and poetry existing together. And you got to study each individually and then ask yourself, how do they relate? Oh, it makes it very interesting. That's when you start feeling the challenge of studying prophecy. Especially when you got that, and you got narrative, you got poetry, and you're looking at textual observations, and then you see the symbolism, the figurative language, and you just want to say, okay, you know what? I'm never going to preach a prophetic passage in my life. You know, you just say, I give up. Well, I'm here to tell you, don't give up. There's a way to get this done, okay? And so when you look at narrative and poetry, the amount of data that you're going to collect will be about the same, be the equivalent, when you add them together. It may seem like a little bit more work because you're actually having to analyze two genres, not just one. But you have to understand that they're both smaller in comparison. But you still, after all that's done, you can't forget about sermon analysis and foretelling analysis that will come next. And so that will add to it. Now, when both genres appear, I have this in the notes. When both genres appear in the passage, and there exists significant narrative portions within the passage, the general guiding principle is this: that the narrative genre dominates. The poetical passage is used more in a servant role to help the narrative aspect continue its movement, like as a story. You'll see that the narrative part dominates. It's like when you have a pure narrative passage and you have a quotation, like maybe the Old Testament. Remember in the Gospels, think about the Gospels. In the Gospels, the Old Testament is being quoted sometimes by the author. Maybe Jesus is quoting the Old Testament and Matthew records that. The quotation seems to be a servant to the narrative, right? To the larger flow of the story. Think of it like that. Now, that's a general guiding principle. It doesn't mean it happens in 100% of the cases. But for the majority that I have found in studying prophetic genre, whenever I see this happen, whenever I see a prophetical passage that has a predominance of narrative and some poetry, the narrative dominates. If I see a majority of poetry with just maybe one little statement of narrative, the poetry dominates. A good example of this is Zechariah chapter 11. You'll see it there. Isaiah chapter 6, you'll see it there. Daniel chapter 9. You look at Daniel chapter 9, it's a lot of narrative. But at the very end of the chapter, is a poetical section. And that poetical section, even though it's rich, and we'll look at that when we get to foretelling analysis. That's one of the passages that we're going to look at. It plays a servant role to the entire narrative portion above it. So just think about that. Just be aware of that. Now, here's the deal. In class, you need to come to class. Very, very important you come to class. Because here's what's going to happen. We're going to look at the passage of Isaiah chapter 6 throughout the course. The example passage that I'm going to use in class is Isaiah chapter 6. You will notice that on the website there's no Isaiah chapter 6 example. And that's purposely so. I'm going to teach you in class how to do narrative and poetical analysis on that passage. We're going to use that passage as an example. And I'm going to show you how to do it in a more, what I call, visual method of exegesis. Instead of having a sheet of paper that talks about character analysis and writing it out the way you did before, and scene analysis, setting analysis, all those things. That's a lot of work, isn't it? I had you do it that way at the beginning because I wanted you to learn the procedures. I wanted you to be aware of the procedures, the steps that's involved. But now I'm going to teach you how to do the same thing, but in a more visual-driven way. And you'll see that it actually takes less time. It actually makes your time more productive and more efficient. And you're still accomplishing the same goal now. And so that's going to be the new phrase I'm giving, visual method of exegesis. And so you're going to learn how to do this. And we're going to do it in class. Now, Isaiah chapter 6 is a good passage because it is one of those passages that has narrative genre in it, poetical genre, so we can do narrative and poetical analysis at the same time. It also has sermonic elements in it. It has foretelling elements in it. Everything is there. And so that's the passage I'm going to use. So when you come, you're going to see it in your notebook. You're going to see that passage. It's got spaces, blank spaces around it. It's on 3 or 4 pages in your notebook. And you're going to be drawing on it as we do it in class. I'm going to walk you through a visual way of doing exegesis. And when you receive your assigned passage, you're going to do the same thing. That's how you're going to do this. You're going to have to write out your passage, compose your passage every time. You're going to go, oh, the horror. And I know it's but remember, the more you write the passage on a piece of paper, it slows you down and it makes you think about the passage. I'm hoping you learned that from doing it that way in previous courses. So you'll write out the passage, you'll write it on a piece of paper, write it down on a piece of paper that's in your notebook, and then you'll do the narrative analysis procedure, poetical analysis procedure, or a combination of the both, but you'll do it in a more visual way. So come to class, be ready for that. So there's no assignment you have to work on yet, okay? But I'm hoping and praying you watched this video before you came to class. I want you to be prepared with this information. And I think we're going to have a wonderful time when we're together and looking at this and doing exegesis in a more visual way. And it's going to help you, I think, gain more confidence in your exegetical study and your approach. And I'm also doing this to prepare you for what's coming in course number 5. In course number 5. And how we're going to work through that course, the final course of the program. So again, God bless, and I'll see you in class, and begin looking over these things, and we'll get you started studying your passage after we meet to discuss Isaiah chapter 6.